Okay, greetings everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar series, which we have been co-hosting between University of Delaware's Minerals, Materials and Society program in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences and the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Sustainable Separation of Metals, which is an NSF-sponsored center. They've been very generous in supporting the speakers in this series thus far. This is, I think, now our fourth speaker in the series. Professor Eric Shelter and Dr. Marta Guron are on, who are the leaders here, and they may say some further details later towards the closing about the center. The website of the center has a lot of useful material, and we find this a great collaboration between natural science, technical community, and social science, applied sort of humanities community. And it's in that spirit of cognitive exchange. And NSF is also supporting a project at the University of Delaware, which has congruence with this. I'd like to especially acknowledge Professor Julie Klinger, who initiated that NSF project, and then we connected with Eric and team. That project is on the illicit flow of minerals, technology minerals particularly, and using artificial intelligence technologies to track that illicit flow. So that's a 5-year NSF project, which we just started about 6 months ago. So there's a lot of NSF camaraderie in this assemblage here. And then our distinguished speaker also has an NSF connection. And so now I will take a moment to introduce Professor Jessica Smith, who is joining us from Golden, Colorado. She is an associate professor in engineering, design, and society. And she's also the director of a new graduate program at Mines, as Colorado School of Mines is affectionately called Mines, for those of you who know the space. And she directs this program titled Humanitarian Engineering. It's a new graduate program. She's an anthropologist by training and has published numerous important works. I should mention her most recent book is titled Extracting Accountability: Engineers and Corporate Social Responsibility, which was published by MIT Press earlier this year. And this book was funded by a Cultivating Cultures for Ethical STEM grant from the National Science Foundation. And courtesy of that grant, this book is actually available for free, open source at the MIT Press website, which was provided to you in the link. So this is a great resource which you can avail of without spending a dime. She's also published another notable academic book, which is about Wyoming's Powder River Coal Basin, and it's titled Mining Coal and Undermining Gender: Rhythms of Work and Family in the American West, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2014. She's a co-convener of the STS Underground network, and she has co-organized a forum at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in the past, which was titled Energy Ethics: Fragile Lives and Imagined Futures. She's also worked in other parts of the world apart from the US, in Peru and Colombia. Particularly, she's had an NSF PIRE grant, which is the Partnerships in International Research and Education. And her course on corporate social responsibility was named an exemplar in engineering ethics by the National Academy of Engineering. And in fact, we may well have some members of the National Academy of Engineering joining us. Professor Levi Thompson from UD's, who's the Dean of our College of Engineering, is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. So we're delighted that you were able to join us. Jessica, you're going to talk about a more panoramic field, but I'm sure you will touch about on your book as well. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you for that introduction and for the invitation. And thank you to Eric and Marta for making it happen. I'm really honored to be here and to be able to share part of my work with you. I'm going to be, I selected one portion of this book that just came out that I thought might be most relevant to the work that your important center is doing. And that is this idea of the ethic of material provisioning and how it shapes the ways in which we think about what more sustainable research futures might look like. So it's difficult for me to underestimate the influence of this ethic of material provisioning. I find it at the beginning of all conference presentations, academic lectures, and the ways in which engineers and scientists who work in the mining and oil and gas industries think about their work and its place in the world. And what this ethic of material provisioning is this idea that the mining and energy industries and the people who work in them are ethically good because they provide the material basis for modern life. And while there are things that make it very specific to the mining and oil and gas industries, just given their centrality to our material life, I think it's part of a much longer history of US engineering in which the profession positioned itself and its value as serving US national ideals of low cost mass use. So the anthropologist and STS scholar Gary Downey shows that the engineering profession really rested on facilitating our modern consumer society in the US. As Salim mentioned, my first big research project was in northeastern Wyoming's Powder River Basin. And this was the first place that I came across this ethic of material provisioning. Growing up there, kind of knowing people who worked in the coal industry and talking with them, and then later doing focused ethnographic research for my graduate project. What I found was that when people were talking about their work and why they worked and what it meant to them, they would always go back to the idea that they were providing electricity for the rest of the country. They were making it possible when they went out to night shift for people to be able to turn on their lights, that it was because of their everyday labor that people could charge their devices and use cell phones, even if kind of the people who relied on their electricity didn't know it. As I came to Mines about 10 years ago, I found this idea embedded inside of kind of the mining and petroleum communities in that university. And as I started on this larger research project, understanding how engineers who practice in these industries think about the social responsibilities of their work and how their definitions of social responsibility influence their careers and everyday decision making. What I found was that these deeply felt personal narratives about why their work was valuable and why their industries were valuable actually were cut in the cloth of these much longer industry cases that they were making to the public, and why kind of the public should appreciate and support the mining and oil and gas industries. So one of the earliest references I could find was the Anaconda Copper Company back in the 1920s, when they adopted the slogan "From Mine to Consumer." And then in the 1940s, as the US was experiencing kind of mass suburbanization, they really tied the value of the copper industry to creating all of these suburbs and homes. So their ads argued, quote, "There's copper in your radio, copper and copper alloys in your refrigerator, plumbing and heating equipment." And what's striking to me is when you look at contemporary company discourse, it's very similar. So during my research, the most controversial new mining project was PolyMet's copper nickel project in northern Minnesota. And when those company representatives were out on the conference circuit, the folks creating their public relations materials, it's the very same idea, but updated to our current time. So found in everything from wind turbines to diabetes test strips, cancer treatments, and car exhaust catalysts, the metals from our project are essential to our everyday lives. Imagine life without electricity, cars without pollution controls, and medical care without many of today's medical devices. The oil industry engages in similar kinds of rhetoric. You may remember a few years ago, Exxon had a commercial that took a woman in what's ostensibly kind of a middle-class kitchen, and she's trying to boil an egg, and the camera goes through all of the infrastructure specific to oil and gas that's required to actually make that egg and transport it and cook it in this kitchen. Another good example of this was back in the 1950s on the 75th anniversary of Standard Oil, in which they argue that progress that we take for granted comes from the oil and gas industry. So most of the rubber we use in this country does not come from trees, it's made from oil. Man-made fibers are derived from oil, asphalt roads, medicines, all made from that incredible chemical wonderbox petroleum. But most important, oil is energy, energy to lighten man's toil and to increase his time for leisure and study. So you will find this everywhere throughout companies that support mining and oil and gas industry, as well as the major players. So these are photos from a recent SME conference, the last one before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what you see here is Komatsu is linking kind of a woman's enjoyment of a cell phone back to minerals. And then you see the service company is positioning itself as serving industries that make modern life possible. There's a group here in Colorado that's headquartered here called the Minerals Education Coalition. And this ethic of material provisioning is fundamental to all of their educational material, which is dedicated to helping the American public appreciate just how much they depend on the mining industry. And if you've ever had the opportunity to tour through the National Mining Museum and Hall of Fame in Leadville, Colorado, that museum has an entire floor that has recreated a typical American home. And then there are these little signs everywhere that explain where you need minerals in unexpected places. What's been really interesting to me is that as we move kind of closer and closer to this transition to greener electricity and energy in general, that a lot of the mining industry's arguments for kind of public acceptance of mining activity has been that solar, wind, batteries especially, all require mined materials, and that the American public tends to forget that as they think about kind of this coming energy transition. So these are photos of a copper car that Rio Tinto had on display at Sustainable Resources for Future Generations conference back in the mid-2010s. You can see that they've decorated it kind of with the importance of mining for kind of green energy futures. And so this ethic of material provisioning, I think, is so durable and so widespread for a few reasons. And the first is that it does reflect some truths about the mineral economy. And there are people on this call who are more expert in this area than I am, but increased kind of deployment of renewable energy, of batteries for electric cars, does require mined minerals. And we have a serious upcoming gap if we're going to meet some of the targets that we've set for ourselves. And as I alluded to earlier, it really grabs people because it provides personal value and meaning for their work. And I wrote about this in depth in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. But to give you kind of a sense from how people spoke about their lives, the overall research included 75 industry professionals, focused interviews with them, often multiple, lots and lots of what anthropologists call participant observation. So being with people as they go about their everyday lives, spending a lot of time in conferences and just kind of embedding yourself in this world. And every single person I talked to expressed this in some way. And so this quote here is from a petroleum engineer who had begun by describing how she was initially skeptical about going into this field, but the more time she spent there, the more she realized how important it was. So this is her quote. She says, "In countries that don't have oil and gas, their hospitals, the power shuts off and on, and they run on a generator. We're in the United States able to have babies in incubators 24 hours a day and people on respiratory devices and all this stuff because we have a consistent power source. Solar can't provide that, wind can't provide that. We have a better society because of oil and gas and coal. They are the moral responsible thing." And so what you see in this interview excerpt here is that literally the building blocks for living, being able to breathe, being able to reproduce, she's tying back to oil and gas and mining here. So the conditions of possibility for modern life rest on those industries. And again, there is a lot of truth to that. At the same time, this ethic and the way it's deployed in different circumstances can unintentionally or perhaps intentionally, I'm not going to make that judgment, it can silence dissent and justify local harms and dislocations in terms of the greater good. So this is a quote from a leader of a First Nations group who was at that big conference in Canada. And we had just been through this whole session in which there was a lot of argument that we need mining and oil and gas in our everyday life. And what his response was the following. He said, "I hear it often in these kinds of events. There's a real bemoaning of the industry saying, if only people understood us. It's kind of sounds like the dad talking to the kids. If you guys only understood what I did for you, how hard I worked for you to put food on the tables, minerals in your phones, then you would appreciate me." And given the long-term research that I've been doing in these industries and spending a lot of time teaching a big cohort of students who are going to go work in them, one of the concerns that my research raises is that the dominance of this ethic can push out more forward-thinking industry individuals who would actually be really important to stay. So this is a narrative from a metallurgical engineer who went to work for one of the world's biggest copper companies. And she starts off by saying that it was this idea that she was making everyday life possible for people around the world is what drew her to industry. She said, "I could really get behind this idea that every day I made a product that went directly into a stream of more products. So literally everyone was impacted by the work that I did. Anyone who goes to a hospital, anyone who picks up the phone, anyone who has a roof over their head or copper pipes in their home. I could really deeply feel that the work I was doing was going to have an impact. I could literally see where it was." And what she described was she really wanted to use her position to ask bigger questions about mining and specifically about the life cycle and if there were ways that you could recycle and maybe lessen the need to continually be mining more to complement it. And she didn't get any traction. She kept hitting brick walls. And so she left because what they were presenting her was an opportunity to go clean up rivers, engage in these local environmental projects, go teach kids about recycling, but not rethink the actual way the mining industry worked or their company in particular. And so what she said was the following. She said, "I could see that what I was doing, in theory, was good, but it was really hard for me to feel that those engagements were actually authentic because I was basically just telling people, keep buying things that have all of these goods in them because I'll go to the river and pick them up when you dump them there." So she ended up quitting and she went into social impact consulting. Academics, I think, would take this ethic of material provisioning and argue that it serves as what the anthropologist Laura Nader calls a harmony ideology, which is a search for balance that domesticates conflict and often reproduces the status quo. And the concern with harmony ideologies is that they can narrow debate and dialogue. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to choose an example from the unconventional energy boom that we experienced in Colorado, especially deeply during the time I first arrived at Mines and then throughout this research. And what this looked like, there we go, is because of these twin technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, it opened up all of these areas in the northern suburbs and Front Range that didn't have their own historic memory of oil and gas production, even if it had been there many, many years before. So here you can see kind of the overlay of all of these wells kind of with these northern suburbs. And so it was highly controversial. And one of the specific concerns surrounded truck traffic. So my colleague, Adrienne Krebs at Mines, she went through and made a calculation of how much truck traffic each of these wells instigated. For those of you who are less familiar, the kind of wells that oil and gas operators use when they're using horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing is that they put as many wells as possible on one increasingly large well pad instead of having these individual vertical wells that you might have seen if you've driven around the American West or elsewhere. And while they celebrate that this kind of concentrates the impacts, so it influences less people, the people who have to deal with those impacts deal with kind of greater magnitude of impact, and truck traffic is no exception. So she found that these well pads that were being made in Colorado had estimated development times, which were 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of drilling, completion, and flowback operations of 20 months with associated truck traffic of 55 to 108 round trips per day over that whole time frame, plus an ongoing 23 truck trips daily during their production lifetime. So this is a lot for people who are living by these places. And so a group of engineers that I was doing research with and participant observation with, they decided that their solution was going to be what they called a STIM center. So they used the term stimulation to refer to when they actually frack the well and start the production. And the idea of a STIM center was that instead of having the trucks go to every single well location, kind of to bring all of the fracking fluid and then to haul all of the produced water off, that they would create one centralized place down here that would be connected by pipeline to all of these different pads. And they could send all of the trucks here and then at a distance kind of engage in all of the kind of well stimulation and then get everything back up. And so the idea was that they could be more specific with where they were going to place that STIM center to make it less impactful for the people who were living there. And I think this is a really good case of how kind of in this desire to keep producing more and more minerals for a world that seems to continually demand more and more, it can narrow the kinds of questions that I think we ought to collectively ask and debate about the worlds in which we want to live. So the STIM Center asks the question of how can mineral development be done responsibly? And I think that's a very important question, and I'm glad that this is a question that kind of has become embedded inside of both of these industries. But I don't think it's the only question that we should be asking. I think we should also be asking, should mineral development be done? And should it be done here? Should it be done now? And be more deliberate with it. And this became very clear as I spoke with a geological engineer in particular, who was very articulate about the difference between what he saw as big R responsibility and little r responsibility. So he described himself as being a very committed environmentalist. He had a lot of commitments to kind of the wilderness, and he went into geological engineering because he thought it would help him protect that. he showed up to career fair and realized that all of the companies that were hiring geological engineers were mining and oil and gas companies. And he accepted a job with an oil and gas company headquartered in Houston that was known for being progressive inside of the industry, and that this job would help him repay his student loans. And he described his increasing feelings of discomfort in the following way. He said, with the little policies that they did, and here he's referring to the rest of the company, I actually felt pretty comfortable. They made sure to design their wells with a pretty high safety standard. So for him, this is little r responsibility. So in the context of resource production, how can we make sure that it's done responsibly? He says, but I felt uncomfortable in Houston, a city designed for and by petroleum that is this energy draining pinnacle of the problem of how our cities are designed. At the end of the day, I felt uncomfortable with the fact that I was living in a city driving over 25 miles to the office every day in my car. You can imagine that if you have this broader philosophy, which I had, there's only so many micro excuses you can make to yourself until you find it impossible to reconcile how you're living with what it is that you're doing. And so for him, he thought big R responsibility, kind of the full measure of his responsibility as a geological engineer, was thinking about not just how do we produce more oil and gas, but how can we change our infrastructure and our everyday lives? He wanted to rethink transportation. And secondly, ought we be thinking about conservation and efficiency in addition to increased production? And then he found kind of very little traction for asking those kinds of questions. And what strikes me about all of this is that it's very reminiscent of some of Laura Nader's work back in the 1970s. So she was the only social scientist that was invited to participate in these federal level committees about the future of atomic energy. And she ended up writing a lot about her experiences there. And I think what she experienced still resonates with some of the challenges that we're facing now. What she found was that the people on that committee, primarily kind of engineers and scientists, that it was that they couldn't ask questions. They didn't entertain questions about conserving energy, and instead they just wanted to think about how to produce more and more and more. And they didn't want to think about kind of other alternatives like solar. Kind of they were very focused on nuclear energy, I think, given the topic. And so what she writes, I think, still holds true. She says, the coming era will require thinkers who understand problems and conflicting value systems. The energy problem is not a technological problem, it is a social problem. You must look at the concept of progress and decide whether, in fact, simple progress is what we have now. We must decide whether progress as a concept should be reserved for something that improves the quality of life. The toughest problem will be getting professionals to look inside themselves to see what their mindset problems are. What is it about my anthropological training that makes me see things in a certain way? What is it about your technical training that makes you see certain things and not others? No one is comfortable exploring these questions about themselves, but it's part of the job that has to be done. So I've been, from my own position at Minds, trying to kind of move forward with some of her provocations. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about two things. The first was the work that I've done inside of engineering education to open up some of these big macro ethical concerns. And then I'll conclude by laying out kind of the outlines of what new frameworks of accountability might look like beyond this ethic of material provisioning. Throughout the research, it was not just a typical anthropological research study that involved ethnographic interviews and participant observation and archival research, but at the same time, I was engaging in critical participation in engineering education, with the idea that what I was learning in the ethnographic research would inform how we were teaching our students and how we were designing courses and assignments. And then what we were learning from the students would influence what we were researching and the kinds of questions we were asking of our interlocutors. And sometimes there were just really meaningful connections. So this here is Art Biddle and Stan Dempsey. They were in charge of AMAX Minerals' large expansion during the 1960s and 1970s. And AMAX was really ahead of curve. I ended up writing about this in one whole chapter in terms of getting public approval for these really controversial mining projects. And a lot of their lessons, I think, were embedded into industry. And Art and Stan still live in Golden, and they were able to come in and work with our students and play the role of a concerned stakeholder, kind of when they were doing their kind of simulated community engagement things in our classes. The productive opening point for a lot of this collaborative teaching and curriculum development was because social responsibility is such a key concept for engineering as a profession. So Edwin Layton, in his foundational history of the US engineering profession, argues that, well, he points out, as other historians of science and technology show, is that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, engineers were not considered a different kind of professional. They were considered skilled labor alongside carpenters and welders. And so as engineers were trying to position themselves as kind of middle-class professionals, it was the idea that their commitment to social responsibility would distinguish them from laborers. At the same time, it would distinguish them from managers, kind of who were accountable to financial bottom lines and representing shareholder interests. So kind of social responsibility was going to be the bedrock of engineering as a profession itself. And the classwork that we did at 4 different universities, all had very focused resource programs. So Colorado School of Mines, Virginia Tech, Marietta, they have what I think might still be, but at the time was the only petroleum engineering program inside a liberal arts college. And then South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. We worked with over 1,200 students and we adapted to each specific class, but the one thing that they all had in common was we taught them corporate social responsibility as a socio-technical practice. And this is important for science and technology studies, because it's very easy for all of us, kind of engineers and social scientists alike, to fall into what Wendy Faulkner calls a technical social dualism. And that's this idea that the world can be divided into a technical realm and a social realm, and engineers belong on the technical. And these two things might influence each other, but they're fundamentally separate things. And what this means for corporate practice is that engineering fall on the technical side, and then CSR would be treated as a social concern, as communication that after all of the engineering decisions have been made. And people who practice in industry see the fault of this, that it's much more efficient if instead of dividing the world into 2, that you think about socially responsible engineering as a whole, and that you would use input and concerns kind of from your local stakeholders to influence the engineering itself, instead of just viewing it as kind of a tool to gain public acceptance. So we've been wanting our students to think about how something like designing a tailings pond, creating kind of the pipeline maps, that those are fundamentally social and political issues, not just technical ones. So they need to evaluate them kind of from that broader perspective. This was also important because it helps our students and our faculty move from what scholars call old corporate social responsibility to new corporate social responsibility. So old CSR, you can think about it in terms of throwing money at a problem and hoping that it helps the company look good. So philanthropy, charity, volunteering, public relations. That's different from new corporate social responsibility, which involves actually adapting core business practices in the first place to promote shared social, environmental, and economic value. And so engineering here, when you use it to think about promoting these wider social, environmental, and economic goals, that fits within this realm of new CSR. We worked in all kinds of different classes, from field-based classes, as you see in this photo here, to seminars, to kind of very technically focused core engineering curricula, with the goal that students would be able to be introduced and kind of be able to practice some of these more expansive notions of engineering. One of the big complaints that I heard in listening to engineers through interviews, through participant observation, is that they were presented such a technically narrow undergraduate curriculum that when it came time for them to go out into the world, they felt really unprepared to deal with public engagement and public conflict in particular. So we provided students training so they would be aware of what those corporate practices were. They would be able to have some skill and proficiency in engaging with the public and answering questions, for example. And for me, what was important was to move students from kind of their gut knee-jerk place, which is when they were confronted with criticism, they wanted to unload a whole bunch of technical facts to help change someone's mind about whether they thought fracking was good or bad, to a place in which they would be able to actually listen to people who were critical of them in their field to figure out what their concerns actually were and what their values actually were. So for example, in Colorado, all of the oil and gas companies started doing these community meetings that were kind of structured like a science fair. So we had our students do the same thing and get practice. One of the things that we underlined through this work was helping them identify when win-wins weren't possible and when there were overflows that didn't neatly fit inside of this ethic of material provisioning, which they also had really invested in. So this is a quote from a petroleum engineer, and she was explaining, she was really proud of that STEM center that I had talked about earlier. But at the same time, she acknowledged that she viewed the STEM center as this win-win because it allowed her company to keep operating at the same time as it minimized negative impact for many people and it provided some economic good. But she acknowledged that that win-win broke down when you had people who didn't want oil and gas activity in their neighborhood at all. And so what she says here, she says it's difficult because you're working for the company and you're a company employee, but at the same time, I can relate to these people too and the impacts that they, and then she just kind of trailed off and symbolically handed this problem over to the stakeholder engagement team, who are kind of supposed to deal with reconciling perhaps these irreconcilable value differences. And so with our students, what we've been trying to help them see is that it is valuable to try to optimize, and engineers can be very good at this, and that you should be trying to create good for a lot of people, but you have to think about how you're defining what a win is, who gets to define what that win is, and who the win is for, and then acknowledge that you might not be able to get everyone on the same page. Once you see that, then you can start to identify overflows and information that can't easily become actionable feedback. So it's much easier when you're listening to someone and they don't want their pipe delivered to the well by their house at 3 a.m. It's easier to change that delivery to be 9 a.m. When people are already at work. It's much more difficult to integrate concerns about whether we should be continuing to expand oil and gas production. That's outside of the win-win for these folks. And lastly, it's really been our goal to nurture different kinds of agency students. So social scientists use the term agency to refer to our capacity to act. And when we're stuck in kind of just trying to create win-wins and living inside of this ethics of material provisioning, it positions engineers as deliverers of compromises that create some good for particular people while safeguarding the profitability of companies. And this is good. And I'm not saying we should stop doing this, but they can also be collaborative problem definers. They can be listeners. They can be more participatory solution deliverers that I think would kind of make for more robust public accountability. So we've published the findings from the engineering education part of this research widely. You can find references on my website. We did pre and post surveys for all of the 1,200 students we worked with to see how our teaching had influenced their knowledge, skills, and attitudes about corporate social responsibility and engineering. And what we found was the following. We found that at the end of the classes, students had a greater ability to identify social performance as a key dimension of engineering responsibility beyond economics and the environment. That they had broadened their views of legitimate stakeholders to include activists who were opposed to their industries. And this is actually very significant because a lot of our students were just in the mode of ignoring and kind of insulting people who would say bad things about mining or petroleum engineering, which you can imagine is not a productive way to approach people opposed to your industry. And so even getting them to the place where they would see people with questions or criticisms as a legitimate stakeholder that they had to address was a big deal. Our students expressed a clear preference for compromise solutions. So they were more likely to hold up local hiring as a good example of CSR rather than redesigning infrastructure to be more accountable to community concerns. We found that their learning was more transformative when practicing engineers were included. I think for lots of reasons I could talk about in the Q&A. We also had suspected, but then found hard evidence that specialized electives, such as the corporate social responsibility class that I teach, really preach to the choir. The students who enroll are already those who think that CSR is important. This underlines the really crucial nature of anthropologists and others such as myself working with engineering faculty in their classes to reach students as a whole, not those who've already been converted. And then we were surprised that even though our students increased their knowledge of corporate social responsibility and a greater commitment to it, they didn't necessarily express a desire to work for more socially responsible companies. I think that could be because they're trying to level their own expectations or kind of they're receiving other messages from industry during their internships. So for the last kind of brief part of this talk, I want to conclude by thinking about what other frameworks of accountability would be helpful for us to think capaciously about what more sustainable resource futures could look like, and really advocate a move away from this ethic of material provisioning to a new ethic of relation. So I'm someone who has really deep personal and professional connections with the mining industry in particular, but 100 years of telling people that they need the stuff that mines produce hasn't helped people love and accept mining. And so my hunch based on my own research and on reading is that we actually need to rethink how mining companies and professionals relate with the public, not just tell them that they need us. So right now, when I was doing my interviews, there were kind of two main ways that engineers thought about what their relationships with the public should look like. The biggest one was the social license to operate. And then toward the end of my research, kind of ESG, environment, social, and governance was really rising quickly in popularity. And a part of me celebrates this because both of these frameworks indicate a widespread acknowledgement that the industry must be responsive to communities and the public at large. And there was a landmark study that demonstrated that having good community relationships, or at least an absence of conflict, was actually financially good for companies. And this study was able to quantify just how much companies were losing to conflict on a daily basis, which you see in kind of the shaded slide in the back, which came out of that study. So this is really important because it places community acceptance squarely inside of a company's material interests rather than as ancillary to them. So instead of viewing the community engagement team as being a cost center, you can view them as creating financial value because they're protecting your ability to operate. And on an everyday basis, what this means is that people inside of industry who are advocating for more resources and people and time to do public engagement, they can draw on this to actually make their case to upper management and executives and be successful. At the same time, along with other kind of scholars in this field, I worry that the rapid uptake of this social license to operate language, and now the rapid uptake of ESG, I want to be sure that they don't come to take over a much broader and wider concern about public accountability, that this doesn't stand in for that area of concern as a whole. One of the things that I think is very clear is that the SLO and ESG both serve like the ethic of material provisioning as a harmonizing device. So it's really living in this win-win space in which good community relationships are good for financial performance. And this in itself is not inherently bad, but it fails to adequately address the complexity of social landscapes with diverse stakeholders and competing interests. It can mask overflows that don't fit inside of those win-wins. And in itself, it doesn't provide us concrete guidance on how to navigate power inequalities, divergent interests, and diverse cultures of communication and governance. Individual companies might do that well, but by themselves, those frameworks don't. And I think just in my years of listening to engineers narrate their careers and talking with our students, my other big concern is that communities come to matter as sources of financial risk. And what John Owen and Deanna Kemp strongly suggest is that taking this risk management view when you're going to do community engagement is not conducive to sustainable community development, because that depends on trust and relationship building and collaboration, not just treating people as potential sources of financial risk. This also leaves out ethical goals that don't have clear economic value proposition. So I heard lots of stories of when there's limited budgets and there's a list of all of these different community engagement activities that could be done. It ends up prioritizing those that have a clear financial return on investment, even if these others might have a stronger ethical case. And then lastly, just listening with people. When people came to learn about the importance of the public and keeping the public in mind as an industry professional, those who really identified with the social license to operate really were coming from an instrumentalist position, and that overshadowed what might be intrinsic curiosity about and respect for other ways of life. And so I think that the SLO and ESG and ethic of material provisioning, they're all important in their own way, but they're not helpful in getting us to move kind of from this world of win-wins into a world in which we're fostering capacity for disagreement. And here I'm using disagreement in the way that Chris Kelty does. He's an anthropologist and STS scholar. And for him, disagreement is not just fighting, it's not just protest. Actual disagreement requires being able to understand someone else's perspective and be able to talk through your different perspectives to figure out what you value, and also where your values diverge. And so I think opening up kind of more capacious understandings of what the public good is a good start for asking some of these larger questions. And here I think about the philosopher Carl Mitchum, who's a foremost philosopher of engineering and emeritus from Mines. And what really concerns him is that there's this gap in that engineers are positioned as contributing to or protecting public safety, health, and welfare, kind of as the reason for being of engineering and kind of the ethical goal. At the same time, he says that our undergraduate engineering education doesn't actually help engineering students figure out what public safety, health, and welfare are. So he writes, there's nothing in engineering education or knowledge that contributes to any distinct competence in making judgments about what constitutes human use and convenience, which is the original kind of definition of engineering, let alone public safety, health, and welfare. Engineering as a profession is analogous to what medicine might be if physicians had no expert knowledge of health, or to law if attorneys knew nothing about justice. And for me, this is an invitation for us to think with engineering students, with engineering professionals, about how their work is caught up in these broader social, ethical, political concerns, and to be able to think about what are the opportunities for their work to contribute to some kind of public good, and to be very thoughtful in thinking about who are the publics I can serve, and then what other publics or what other concerns does my solution not actually meet, so that we can have a wider discussion about what more sustainable research futures would look like, not just for the people who stand to gain the most from them. So with that, I'm happy for questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can see each other more easily. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, for such a panoramic presentation, which covered both your research and also some of the pedagogic work or andragogic work, because you're clearly teaching not just children, but which is what pedagogy is, but andragogy, which is adults. There is a question from Bonnie Ram, who is one of our researchers in renewable energy, and especially in wind, and she's a geographer, asking about also this kind of mutual distrust and sort of a chip on the shoulder, which both engineers and social scientists alike have. They're kind of dismissive of each other. So, I mean, you've talked about the engineers' myopia, but on the other hand, us social scientists are sometimes also accused of being, having a certain sense that we deal with justice, and we are the ones who really know the stakeholder zeitgeist. So what would you say to that?
I agree. And I think it's very easy, even for STS scholars and especially for anthropologists and others, we really critique engineers for being inward looking and they're not engaging with social concerns. And anthropologists often don't engage with technical concerns, right? So there's kind of this mutual distrust and ignoring. And these kinds of collaborations have been very difficult. And for me, what makes them easier, both for students and with the engineering faculty that I work with at Mines and elsewhere, is to start with this acknowledgement or discussion about how we create knowledge, because if you are someone who really is a positivist and you've invested your career in the scientific method, the kind of interpretivist interview, participant observation work that we do is going to seem soft. It's going to seem subjective. It's not going to seem like good data. So we tend to have conversations very early on about how we were trained and what our assumptions are and what our own. It's not so much that one kind of research is better than the other, but moving to a place where you can see that one person's research skills are really good at answering some questions, but not all of them. And maybe someone else's training can help you answer those different kinds of questions. And just on like a tactical level, every time someone says the word soft skills, I just interrupt in that moment, right? Because that's such a hierarchical way of thinking about that. So kind of using these little opportunities to ask questions and then create kind of long-term respectful, I think, relationships.
Indeed, no, absolutely. I mean, even Einstein, famously said that social science is hard and math is easy. We have another question from one of our complex systems faculty, James Rising, who's asking about the time scales and how do you respond to people who want to just solve the NIMBY problem?
Yes, and the NIMBY thing, I'm going to take this question in two ways, especially since the last one was about renewables, and I've been doing some work on wind, and people use that NIMBY problem as well. I think what I've been trying to do is kind of bring research that shows that kind of NIMBYism actually doesn't reflect people's concern, and it can be a way of dismissing people's concerns and fears and hopes, I think, surrounding any kind of infrastructure project. So I think being aware of how the terms that we use influence how we interpret other people's actions or thoughts. I think the timescale question is so interesting just in general, because it's easy to get stuck in the present. And I think it's the question of time that's one of the biggest tensions between people who work inside of these industries and people who critique them, right? And I think justifiably so among the people I interviewed, there was this big frustration that critics would say, oh, we have to do away with mining, we have to do away with oil and gas production, but they provided no pathway for doing that. It was just kind of pushed off into this future. But at the same time, if we don't ask those future questions, we're never going to get there in the first place. So
Indeed.
I think
Caitlin has the last question will have to be from Caitlin, and then I'll hand it over to Eric or Marta to wrap up. Okay, Caitlin, you are muted.
Thanks. Sorry. I just had a quick question about, so in my work, I work a lot with communities and remediation projects, mine remediation projects. And so a lot of times like CSR or community engagement processes fall apart when a community or Indigenous governance organization says no, and the idea of consent. And so I guess I'm just wondering how, I find a lot of times engineers or folks working in a more technical binary world struggle with that because they see this process as a way of working out the kinks in order to get to the end goal. And so what happens, I guess, or advice or experience or stories that you have about how to deal with consent and the ability to say no and the power of saying no.
This is a really wonderful and crucial question. And I mentioned the Amex case because it was this, it ended up foreshadowing a lot of what would happen later in both mining and oil and gas, but where their public engagement broke down is that the question they were asking was, how can mining be done responsibly in these ski towns? Not should mining be done at all. And so when there isn't the possibility of people saying no, it makes any company outreach seem hollow. And so I think as long as there's a foregone conclusion that there is going to be this industrial development here, it can be very difficult to get buy-in. And so that's part of, I think, this broader question of if we need these minerals for these particular things, let's have a discussion about where that can be done most responsibly, who would like mining, and who would mining benefit, instead of being on a kind of a project by project basis.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jessica. We've learned and gained so much. So Eric and Marta, over to you for wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Salim. And let me just say again, Jessica, thank you again for a beautiful seminar. This really has us thinking, has me thinking. And I think you've covered a lot of interesting points here for us scientists and engineers to take back and mull over as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Marta for a couple of quick announcements.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot of what we've been talking about as a center is really remembering the context of the work that we do. And this is such an important step in that, and making sure that we don't forget that we are all connected and that this is all part of the same narrative. So thank you for that. A couple just brief announcements. Thank you specifically, of course, to our speaker, Jessica Smith. She has, first of all, delivered this wonderful seminar, but also granted permission for us to record this, as you know, when you walked in, and this will be posted to our YouTube channel later on today. So if one of your colleagues or friends or someone was not able to come, but was interested and wanted to hear more, we want to encourage you to come check out our YouTube channel a little bit later, and you're welcome to view it at your leisure. Also, I posted a brief survey in the chat. It's literally like 2 questions, just asking about your takeaways and you know, how you might have been inspired by the conversation. So if you would just be willing to fill that out for us, we would really greatly appreciate that. And it would help us get a sense of future conversations that we can have as well. So thank you for that. And finally, I did post in there also our Twitter account. And if you'd like to continue the dialogue, and if there are questions that come up there, or if you want to just engage in conversation with other attendees, please, by all means, go ahead and do that. And of course, our website I put in there as well, in case you have more questions or want more information. So I am finished. I would like to ask everyone if we could just thank our speaker one more time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been so generative. I really enjoyed it.